So for those of you just joining us, welcome. Robyn Roscoe will share her expertise with us on project management and specifically scope and quality. Robyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. My apologies for starting a bit late today. So today we're going to be focusing on scope and quality. Just a quick reminder of what we're doing throughout this series. The intention is to provide you with an introduction to the basic elements of project management and ways to be able to apply those in your work. I do provide formal definitions for many things, and these come from the project management body of knowledge. And as Laura said, this is a workshop format, so you should have the scenarios that were previously provided, and we'll be going through some questions around how to apply the principles we're learning today using those scenarios as examples. So again, our learning objectives to know and understand these definitions, but more importantly, to be able to put them into practice in your day-to-day work and your day-to-day life. Our agenda for the overall series is to go through the entire life cycle of a project and all of the main management areas in project management, including initiating, planning, controlling and monitoring, as well as execution and closing. In the previous webinar last month, we were focusing on stakeholders and risks. We talked about classifying stakeholders, considering their requirements and expectations, defining what we mean by risk, and then considering how we might do a risk assessment and analysis for a project, and talk specifically about the SWOT analysis approach to assessing risks on a research project. So we're in the project planning stage of working towards developing a project, a good approach to project management. And today we're going to be focusing specifically on scope and quality. Scope and quality are part of the scope, time, cost, quality balance, which is my version of looking at the main priorities that we want to establish for our project plan, and then the things that we need to be focused on when we're managing our project and encountering change throughout the life of our project, thinking about keeping scope, time, cost, quality, and balance. And when we have a change in one area, what are the changes that we might need to consider in another? We've also, in most projects, defined one or two of these things as being the driving priorities. So the things that we want to keep as consistent as possible during the project, and incorporating changes in other areas in order to maintain that one priority area for us. So we're going to look today at scope. Scope refers to all of the work that must be accomplished to achieve the project objectives. And if we remember, the project objectives are the things that we define at the beginning as what it is that we are trying to accomplish. What are the things we want to do in order to address our strategic question and address the problem that we want our project to solve? The work refers to all of the activities and effort that we're going to put in the work of the project in order to achieve those objectives. So all of the activities and tasks that need to be completed to generate the deliverables to achieve the objectives of the project. Scope management refers to all of the things that we will do in the management of the project to ensure that our project, first of all, includes all of the work required to achieve our objectives, and then throughout the conduct of the project, includes only the work required to achieve the objectives. So we want to make sure that we've accounted for all of the tasks that are needed to complete the work, to make all of our deliverables happen, to address our strategic questions on our project. But we also want to make sure that we have processes that keep out of our project any work that doesn't belong there, that identifies activities that might come into our project that seem like good ideas, but don't actually contribute to our objectives. And so we'll use resources from our project that are intended for our objectives, and then the outcomes of that work won't actually contribute to those objectives. So it's about making sure our work is complete and that it's then protected from interference by other activities or work. The scope planning approach looks like this. We start out with our strategic question, so the problem that we're trying to solve or the question that we're trying to answer. We should have some idea of what the product of our project looks like. So what do we want to see at the end of our project work? What will be the thing that needs to be there that addresses our problem or question? If we're working in a very formal project setting, we may have something called a project charter. A charter is kind of like a contract agreement between all of the parties that will do work or provide support to a project, and really sets the stage for all of the questions that we want to address. What are the resources that are going to be available? What are the things that are included in our project and are out of bounds for our project? But for the most part, research projects don't often have a project charter, partly because the work that we're doing, by its very nature, research has got a lot of uncertainty associated with it, and the boundaries that we would want to live with in that project need to have a lot of flexibility. And so a charter is not usually a tool that we would see in research, but it might be something that you encounter. So we would take all of this documentation and information, and then we would go through some steps, perhaps doing a cost-benefit analysis around the different types of approaches that we might take. We might look for alternative ways of doing the work. Maybe since the time the project was initially conceived, there are some additional approaches that we might take, or other information that partly or entirely addresses our strategic question. So is there a different way that we can get to our answer other than doing the work of the project? Another approach that we can take here is to take the product, the thing that we're planning on making, and break that down into smaller pieces to understand what work needs to go into each one of those pieces that would then come together to create the product that we're working towards. And from this, we should end up with a document that's called a scope statement. A scope statement has these 6 components associated with it. And you'll notice that several of the pieces of information that are listed here as the scope statement are things that we've already discussed in this webinar series. We need our project justification, so we need that strategic question, the problem that we're trying to solve or the question that we're trying to answer, as the rationale for why we would want to do this work. We should also have a description of our product. What is the thing that we want to see at the end of the day that will solve our problem? If you remember when we talked about project initiation and we had our strategic question and lots of different ways in which we might address that strategic question, and we narrowed those down by asking some questions about feasibility and desirability, and ended up with a specific project that we were going to do. That project and the product of it is the product that we need to have a description of here. We also need to know what the objectives of the work are, so those to-do statements about what we want to accomplish. We need to have those prepared at this point. We also need to have our list of deliverables, the specific things that we are going to make or that we want to see at the end of the day that will come together to satisfy those objectives and make our product. We also will have supporting information. So this can come in the form of the constraints and assumptions that we defined during our planning process. It can also come in the form of our stakeholder list and what the requirements and expectations are of our stakeholders. If we've had an opportunity at this point to do a risk assessment, that would also be part of our supporting information. What we define in our risk assessment will inform what specific activities we can and cannot do in order to live within the opportunities and threats that are a part of our project. And last piece here, which is about defining all of our work, but more importantly, keeping out of our project the work that doesn't belong there, is our scope management plan. And really this is all of the things that are going to be done from the management perspective to keep the project within the scope. We can think about the scope as being a set of boundaries within which all of the work of the project will happen. But we need some tools to be able to keep reminding ourselves of what those boundaries are and checking that the work that we're doing is within those boundaries. And that's the tools that we would use and define in our scope management plan. So this would include things like progress reporting, gathering information from all of the people the stakeholders within the team who are responsible for the work of the project. We would also do reviews of the progress of the project at set milestones. Milestones are defined control points within our schedule where we will take specific action. And from a scope management perspective, excuse me, the actions that we will take at milestones would be a review of our progress. So we might tie our progress reporting to our milestones, but typically milestones we would take a pause and consider, does our progress, does all of the work on our project align with what we expected when it comes to the scope of work and what our deliverables and objectives are. Depending on how we've defined quality and whether quality is a driving priority for what we're doing, we could also use quality control as a part of our scope management plan. The quality of the output of the work that we're doing is a reflection of the amount of effort that we're putting in, and so it's related somewhat to the scope of work that we're doing. But quality, and if you remember the scope time cost quality balance, scope and quality live beside one another, and so they directly influence one another quite a lot. So we could use quality control approaches as part of our scope management approach as well. And lastly, we need to make sure that we've incorporated a process for change. Any project, but research projects especially, will have changes that occur throughout the life of the project. We need to have a process by which those changes will be evaluated and considered and approved or accepted into the project plan. Can you give example of when quality wouldn't be a key component in a project? Quality is always a component. I guess, as we talked about in the, I think it was in the first webinar where we talked about driving priorities, sometimes quality is not the number one thing that we're working towards. It's not that there's no quality objectives. It means that the quality of work that we're trying to achieve, we have some leeway or flexibility with respect to that. And maybe that is because cost is the driving priority. We have a very limited amount of money that we can use on the project, and so we have to be flexible and able to and willing to change the quality of the output that we're working towards because we have a limited amount of money. Or maybe the amount of money we have changes in the course of the project, and so we have to adjust what we're working on when it comes to quality. The other thing that might happen, and I think this was in one of the examples, where time is the driving priority. So to a large extent, it doesn't matter how well we do the work that we're doing. Of course, that's important in terms of the success of the project, but the number one thing is whatever it is that we do, it has to be delivered on a specific date. And so you work towards your quality objectives for that, but ultimately the time becomes the thing that you're most focused on in terms of meeting the schedule or the requirements. So it's never the case that we can ignore quality. It's a part of the scope time cost quality balance, but there will be projects where quality is not the driving priority. I hope that answers your question. If not, we're going to talk about quality in a little bit, so we can get into that a little bit more then. So having a process for change is important, as I said, because projects will change. Remember, in our definition of projects, a key element of that definition is progressive elaboration. We have to expect change to happen, and we have to allow for change to happen, but we still have to achieve the objectives of our project. So we need to have ways in which we're going to control that. When we don't have good control over the scope of our project, we encounter this thing called scope creep. Um, and scope creep refers to when we have minor changes that occur, or even major changes, I guess, within the scope of work, the activities that we're actually doing on the project that are not documented and not controlled. And we don't take the time to understand how those scope changes are going to affect the other elements of our scope time cost quality balance. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what that feels like. I'm sure you've all experienced scope creep before, but just to make sure we're all on the same page about what it means. I have two constant examples about that occur when it comes to scope creep, and one of them is in the workplace. I have two researchers who are working on similar projects, but not necessarily the same project, and they happen to cross paths with one another in the hallway or in the elevator, and one says, "How's it going on your project XYZ?" "Oh, it's going really well. We've completed 50% of our work, and so is about to graduate next year, and so everything's looking really good." first person says, that's really interesting. The project that I'm working on is considering something similar, and we're having a little bit of a problem with this method. Do you think that's something that your team would be able to work on and help us sort out? Researcher number 2 says, absolutely, we'd be happy to look into that. Let me talk to the team. And goes back to the team and starts to work on this additional activity because it doesn't seem like it's going to be that big a deal. And yet, it becomes something that takes up a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources by the project team to try and address this question that seems like it's related to the work that they're doing, but actually isn't contributing to the objectives of their own project. And at some point, it gets recognized that there's a deadline coming up, there's some work that hasn't been completed yet. How did we end up spending so much time on something that isn't actually even a part of the project that we're working on? And that's when that happens, you've been kind of attacked by the scope creep monster, and recognize that, oh, we've included something in our work, we've started to do something that isn't actually a part of our objectives. It's not actually within the boundaries of what we're doing. So when we have that happen, we end up with disruptions. We can potentially end up with rework as well if we have to go back and redo some things because the approach that we took was different than what was planned, again, because it seemed like a good idea at the time. That's exactly what scope creep is. If you need a different, more commonplace example of scope creep, just think about any time if you've had the opportunity to go shopping at a place like Costco or a place like IKEA, or even a place like Winners, where you go in, or HomeSense, where you go in with a very specific thing in mind. I need to pick up a wedding gift for my aunt, and the next thing you you come out of the place with a cart filled with stuff because it was on sale, or because it looked nice, or because you were reminded that you needed some of that at home, and you spent a lot more time and a lot more money in the store than you actually were intending when you first went in. If you think about that experience when you're going through a grocery store and you're adding something into your cart that isn't on your grocery list, every time you do that, that's scope creep. Because especially when you get to the checkout and you find that you're paying way more than you expected to when you went in, it's because your scope has changed, and so your cost has changed. It's all those little tiny things, all those little extra things that we add to our cart that are scope creep. What's a diplomatic answer that researcher 1 might give to researcher number 2 to buy themselves some time? So some of it depends, I guess, on what role the researcher 1 and 2 have within the grand scheme of things. Generally speaking, the right answer is to say, that sounds like a really good idea. I'll look into that and get back to you. It's very dangerous to make a commitment on the strength of an elevator conversation, especially when it comes to assigning work to other people, or committing resources that may or may not be available, that may or not even be within your realm of authority to allocate to something. And so it is probably the best answer to give is to say, that sounds really interesting. It definitely sounds like there's some potential for collaboration there. Let me look into it and see what we might do. How about we have a meeting about that? And that gives you some time to go back and confer with the rest of the team, maybe explore what resources are available. If other people with decision-making authority need to be involved in that, you can get them involved in it as well, and actually make a plan to say, yes, we want to include this, or no, we don't. It's also important because in that situation, that elevator or hallway conversation, you likely don't have enough information about what the other person is really asking you to do. And getting more information about what is required and desired is really important to make sure it is something that you can incorporate into the plan. Remembering that because progressive elaboration is that key element of a project, it's not unheard of that you're going to change what you're going to do, especially if it will augment the potential outcomes of the project, maybe be a better or way of approaching the work on the objectives. Maybe there's an additional win that might be gained from that. You help out researcher number one today, they're going to help you out in the future tomorrow. All of those kinds of things become a part of the conversation. But taking the step back and the time to think about it is important. I always talk about this we want to stamp out scope creep. We don't want to let it happen within our projects. I used to have this image as a poster on the wall in my office because I said it so often in meetings, we don't want to have scope creep. And I had a researcher came in when I wasn't around and wrote on the side of it, scope creep is essential to good science. And their point was, if we don't allow ourselves that flexibility to consider additional directions or additional options, science becomes, it loses that freedom of inquiry that it needs to have in order to be effective. And I completely agree that research and science and even any project needs to have that flexibility, that opportunity to explore alternatives when those present themselves. But what that really is scope change. And scope change is that process of saying, hey, that sounds like a really good idea. Let's explore what that means. Let's have a think about what will that mean if we incorporate that change to our project? What are all of the other things that will have to change as a result of doing that? What are all of the things that we might now not be able to do because we're going to dedicate some resources to that new thing? What are some of the additional risks that we might be introducing to our project? Or is this an opportunity now that we're able to take advantage of because this change has potentially presented itself? So I fully encourage projects and project managers to look at opportunities for scope change. It's a part of progressive elaboration. It's a part of good research and science. But if we're going to manage our projects properly, we still have to somehow fit within that scope, time, cost, quality balance. And so those boundaries that we've set for ourselves of what our scope is and is not help us do that and ensure that our projects will be successful. It's not a help to the project to take on the work for researcher number one, satisfy their objectives, and then not be able to meet the objectives of our own project. That's a failure. And we need to make sure if we're going to incorporate that, we still want to be able to do that. I think part of the rest of your question, Natalie, was about if it's not researcher one or researcher two, but it's maybe trainee one and supervisor one, how do you manage that conversation? I would say you would take the same kind of approach and say, that seems like a really good idea. There's a lot of potential there. Why don't we explore how we might be able to do that given all of the other things that are already required? In this work, and take the time to say, here's all of the things that we're currently working towards. These are all of the things that are currently on my plate if it's an individual conversation, and say, here's what we're now considering doing. Let's look at where that might fit within the current priorities that I have and the current allocation of my time to these things. We had an experience of doing exactly this here in my work environment just in the last couple of weeks. We've been working towards, we decided at the beginning of the year that one of our objectives for the year was to get accredited for delivering whole genome sequencing services in a clinical environment for what they call germline mutations, so basically hereditary mutations. We can do that now, but in a very targeted way, and we wanted to expand the scope of that so that it would include a whole genome sequencing approach, so looking at any mutation that might occur within the genome. That's it in a nutshell. But when we worked out the project plan for that, it was going to take 12 to 14 months for us to be in a position to apply for that accreditation. And it was going to involve the work of about a dozen people in various different areas within the organization. So they've been working on that since the beginning of January. And we have a project manager who's helping them keep on track and make sure we're following the plan. And when we deviate from the plan of what we need to do, what does that mean for our timeline or for the costs of work or for the quality of what we're doing? In this instance, quality was a driving priority. Whatever it is that we did, we had to meet the standards that were required by accreditation. So that meant if it was going to take us longer to do it, then so be it. And if there were additional tasks that were needed, so if our scope needed to expand, then we would need to talk about that, because we did have to balance that with the timelines that we were working towards. A couple of weeks ago, we got an opportunity to be considered for a contract that would see us do not whole genome sequencing work in a clinical environment, but a more limited set of genome sequencing called exome sequencing in a clinical environment. And this was a more immediate opportunity. If we could demonstrate that we could do that in a clinical way, we might be eligible to get a new contract that would be starting in September. So we had to make a conscious choice to say, we're going to change what we're doing in this accreditation project. We're going to press pause on the whole genome sequencing work, and we're going to incorporate this new work activity. And by doing that, we had to assess, what is that going to mean for the quality and the time frame of the first project or the first project activities? Will anything that we're doing on the second activities contribute to and support those first activities? And the answer is yes. A lot of the things that we will develop and learn in the modified approach will end up being supportive of that new project. But we had to, A, make that conscious decision that we were going to change it, B, consider what are all of the other things that need to change about that, and then C, communicate that very clearly to the project team. We were going to do this, and we will still do that eventually, but right now we're actually going to focus on this. And it's really important that you all understand, project team, now we don't work on this thing over here, we work on this thing over here. And that was the approach that we needed to take to make sure that the change was properly accounted for, well communicated, and that we understood the risks and the costs of what we were doing. A big cost is going to be the change in the timeline around the original project. It's basically on hold until we can complete this new one, and then we will revisit the timeline around that. Sorry, that was a longer story than I intended, but a good example, I think, of applying this in the real world. So in summary, scope management refers to what work is needed. So we need to look at the objectives that we have for our project and come up with what are all of the tasks and activities that need to go along with that. So what is all of the work that's required? And then we also need to have a scope management plan to ensure that we have processes in place to recognize and then actively decide upon changes that we might be incorporating into our project. And those processes that we have will hopefully help us avoid scope creep. A big way that we can avoid scope creep in a project is to make sure that everyone on the project team understands this as a concept, so that they can recognize when this might be happening to them, when somebody's talking to them about additional work and activities. It sets off little alarm bells to them that says, wait a minute, this isn't in the scope of what we were planning to do. I should probably talk to somebody about whether or not this is actually going to be incorporated into the project, or whether this is creeping us away from the work that we actually intended to do. And the more people that are familiar with this as a concept within the project team, the more likely it is that someone's going to recognize when the scope is creeping from where it needs to be. All right. So let's look at the case studies that we have. So the first case study on that's been provided to you is broken into two parts. There's a proposal project and then a research project. So for the proposal development component of that, what kinds of things would we need to consider when we're managing the scope of that work? How would we define what activities need to take place, and then what things might we consider in terms of making sure that we don't have scope creep when it comes to the proposal development? So the number of The number of visits to communities, yeah, that would be part of the proposal in terms of determining how much work needs to go on within the project, what is required of the proposal, so maybe the key elements of the proposal document and who would be the best people to work on those things, and then what tasks would those people have to do. Ah, yes. Not turn it into a competition between research areas. Yeah, that's an important part of it, and again, gets back to the whole scope, time, cost, quality balance. Ultimately, your proposal is going to have a limit in terms of how much money, how much time you have to do these things, and it has to be reasonable. If you think about it from a grant reviewer's perspective, it has to be something that they actually think you can accomplish. And so if it looks like there's competition going on, or there isn't a good balance between those elements, it could be that the project is going to be challenged with being successful. And that definitely comes through in the proposal development as well. Who's writing what, and how are we blending all of that together? Yeah, making sure that the work that you're defining in the proposal aligns well to what exactly it is that you're trying to accomplish. And that's really the essence of scope definition, is what is the problem that we're trying to solve, or the question that we're trying to answer? What are the deliverables that we've proposed that would address those things? And so what work needs to go into creating those deliverables to achieve those objectives? And so what's the reason for including something in the project? Identifying who will monitor the project over the 4 years, that's a part of the proposal development, but that would probably be more correctly a part of when the project is funded, who's going to take that on. Um, and then maybe defining what the milestones would be. Again, that's probably part of the work that would ultimately come in the project itself. But our project right now is writing and assembling a project proposal, and so the work that we're going to do within that is what we're looking to define. So, what are all of the elements? The things that I would look for would be, what are all of the elements required for the proposal? Is there an executive summary? Is there a budget and a justification? Do we have to have CVs for each and every person, or just for the PIs? Do we have to show collaborative agreements in place with all of the institutions and partners, or can we just get people to sign on the proposal at this point and get those other things later? So what are the specific documents or pieces of paper that are going to be required? The stakeholders and their requirements and expectations, I'd listed funders and institutions, but thinking about the comment about the potential cooperation / competition between the different project elements, we would want to make sure that we understand how those people are going to be able to work together. What are the risks that we're trying to address within the development of the project plan itself? How are we going to incorporate those things? And then, do we have the right subject matter expertise within the team to be able to put all of the right pieces together? We know we've got the 3 lead PIs that are there, but perhaps are we generating huge amounts of data? So maybe a data scientist is somebody that we need to include. Are we required to, as part of the project, create visualizations of the data, maybe maps that show the different areas that we've been, or the different areas of influence that we've identified from these various communities? Do we need somebody on the team who can contribute to the visualization of all of that in the future? All kinds of different things that would need to come into this, but all of making sure that we've got all of the resources that are necessary to do the work to write the proposal, and how are we going to make sure that we keep the proposal within the scope of what we need to do, that we don't start doing the work of the project before we've actually completed writing the proposal. So thinking then about the research project itself, what would be some of the things that we would want to think about in managing the scope? We've already touched on things like having a timeline and milestones for monitoring. We need to think about the communities that are going to be involved, but what other things would we need to think about in managing the scope? So imagine our project's actually been funded and we've started doing the work. Where are we potentially going to experience scope creep in the project? Yeah, so sometimes considering what the costs of things will give us an indication as to what is the scope of work that's going on. So if there is a requirement for work that involves people going to the communities to conduct interviews or to collect samples, whatever the work is that they're doing, we can get an indication of whether we've got the right scope of work happening by looking at how much is it costing us to send people to the communities. And if it's way more than what we were expecting, that's an indication that either something's changed about the costs that we've put in there, or potentially there are more people going than we had originally planned. And what are all those extra people doing when they get to the community? Because we didn't plan on them contributing to the work of sample collection. So if they're doing something else while they're there, is that within the bounds of scope of work for the project, or is that something that's crept into, well, since you're already going, I might as well go too? That's a classic example of scope creep happening. Um, Rachel, maybe we can touch on that at the end of the discussion today, but that is a very common observation. Yeah, we can start to think about how we would deal with those risks around things that we can't control. Those wouldn't necessarily be a part of the scope, although if we do have disruptions to the conduct of the project because of weather or, as you say, resistance from the community, that will disrupt our ability to conduct the work, and so will disrupt the scope. Those kinds of things more affect the time and the cost, and scope is sort of a consequence of those changes. Will scope creep be more likely when there are multiple PIs? My favorite answer to almost everything is it depends, and I would say that's true here as well. I wouldn't say that it's more likely. Certainly, scope creep, just like communication breakdowns, is more likely to happen the more people you have involved in the conversation. But it really depends on the nature of the PIs themselves, how much they have worked together in the past, how complementary the research areas are that they're working in, and whether those might result in more competition than cooperation. But hopefully that kind of thing would be a bit revealed when developing the proposal and working out the agreements for the project. People who don't want to be working together generally don't make it past the proposal stage anyway. So it may not be an issue. But certainly the more people that are involved, the more potential for scope creep, and there are. The ways that trainees and newer, yeah, so involving, when you have to incorporate new people into the project, you definitely have the potential for scope creep because those people become new stakeholders and they bring their own requirements and expectations into the project. And if it's trainees who we are going to be relying on for doing the work, their abilities to do the work will affect the scope of work, so the activities that are done, but also the quality and the cost and the time associated with that. Yeah, the opportunity with new trainees, new researchers is that they could be bringing in newer, more efficient ideas and different perspectives. That's certainly the opportunity always when you're inviting new researchers and you're engaging newer trainees within a project. Hopefully what you're gaining from that is the opportunity to have those new perspectives and approaches, and that opportunity offsets the threat of their need to be trained, the possible disruption of their new or different approaches and their own expectations and requirements of the work. And it's finding that balance between those two things for those stakeholders. Yeah, questions covered during the interviews which results in added time. This again is specifically about scope creep. While you're sitting there, if it's about interviewing community members, while you're sitting there involved having those interviews, making sure that the interview stays on topic, it can be very difficult in those circumstances because you may identify interesting questions or different pieces of information, and it's important for the people conducting the research to recognize, is the avenue of conversation I'm now having, is that a part of the research work that I'm doing, or is that something I'm exploring opportunistically that's taking me outside of the scope of work that I'm doing? That's important to consider from a scope perspective, it's also really important to consider, even just from an ethics perspective, is the conversation that we're now having within bounds of what we're permitted to be talking about from a research ethics perspective. And so good training and management of those dialogues will be important both for scope management and for ethics management. Scope cost could be high impact and low cost, and absolutely when you have that opportunity to incorporate something that's an easy win, it's very obvious to be able to do it, and it's finding that balance between what is the cost of this change and what is the benefit of this change. And we'll be talking in the live workshop a bit more about evaluating that trade-off between constructive opportunity and destructive intervention when it comes to change. Okay, so just real quickly about how we manage the scope in the research project. A really good question is this something that we were approved to be doing? Is this part of what we said we would do and that was approved by the funder? And if it's not, then we need to have that conversation about, is it a good thing then that we take it on, or is it actually just going to be a distraction from what we're doing? And will we still be able to accomplish the original objectives of the project? Those new stakeholder requirements and expectations, managing things off-site, so in those remote communities, will be a considerable challenge for this project. And so really good tools around control and management will be very, very important. And then having plans in place, as somebody said, to anticipate changes, where we might have challenges accessing remote locations, where we may get there and encounter that the situation is quite different than what we expected. And how do we respond and deal with that? What are the boundaries around which we can, or within which we can make that change? And also, if we have to change some things about our hypothesis. If there are things that we learn in the early part of the project that say, actually our research question was a bit off the mark, we need to adjust what our hypothesis is, or the way we're asking the question that we're trying to answer. And we need to consider very carefully how we would incorporate those kinds of changes and what other changes might then result from that. Where would a communication plan be incorporated into the project planning? So the communication plan is really part and parcel of a lot of this. We're not going to touch on that specifically, but if interactions with communities in particular, so getting that information or having those dialogues with communities is a big part of the project, then that really becomes part of the scope plan in terms of when and how you're going to be interacting with people, how you're going to be gathering their information, how you're going to be feeding back information to them, who's going to have the responsibility of that initial contact and the follow-up and the conduct of the interviews, etc. All of that would be part of, I would consider it to be part of the scope plan for the project, because communication is such a significant element of the work that you're doing. In other research, within the research project that we're talking about, one element of the project is going to shoreline areas and collecting samples. So there isn't really a communication plan that's needed about that, other than the logistics of getting to those places and making sure you have the right resources to collect the samples. But a communication plan around the interactions with the community would be part and parcel of the scope of the work and how you're going to gather the information and meet all of the stakeholder expectations and requirements. I hope that answers your question, Meredith. All right, so getting to the topic of quality, this is a very difficult thing to define in a research environment, because we don't often have very clear metrics that says if you do X number of experiments, you will result in Y value of quality. So we can often define quality around the level of statistical significance or the level of certainty we have with the outcomes based on the number of things that we do. And so we can define quality in that way. But again, a lot of times the quality is a little bit more subjective than that in research. In terms of answering our question, we want our work to be sufficient so that if we're writing our thesis, we want our work to be sufficient so that we can graduate. And that's a very gray area, as many of you know, and so it can be difficult to define what quality means. And from a project management perspective, what we really mean by quality is, will the product that we're generating result in satisfying the needs of the project objective? So will the thing that we're working on solve the problem? Will it address the question that we're working towards? And we need the outputs of the project to have enough quality that we can do that. That what we produce at the end of the day will address the problem that we've set for ourselves. There's different ways that we can evaluate this. We can consider elements like customer satisfaction. So if we're building a product that will then be used by other people in research, so if we're responsible for building a different way that people will use a microscope in remote communities, maybe that's the project that we're working on. So our product at the end of the day is a modified stage for the microscope that people are going to be using. Does the customer, the researchers that ultimately end up using that product, are they happy with what we've given them? Will it actually allow them to do the work that they intended to do? So that's one way of establishing how we might measure quality is the customer, the person who's going to use the output of our project, does it actually become something that they can use? Another way of thinking about how we would manage quality is thinking about, are we going to have activities or processes in our project that prevent poor quality from happening? Or are we going to inspect the work of our project all the way along and adjust it in order to make sure that we're meeting the quality approaches? The prevention approach means we're going to have all kinds of steps and checks and balances along the way so no poor quality work can get through. And that seems like a good idea, except it's very labor intensive and time consuming sometimes. And so we need to make sure when we're doing that, that quality is a driving priority, and quality is important at every one of those instances where we're trying to prevent poor quality. Or is it sufficient for us to do some of the work and then check on it to see what its quality is, get rid of all of the things that are poor quality, or do them again, and then allow the rest of the things to proceed? And this is often the approach that's taken with research and data generation. We'll put some things in place, we'll plan how we're going to generate our data, we'll generate some of that data, and then we'll inspect it to see, is it giving us the results that we need in order to further the work of the project? If the answer is yes, then everything's good with respect to quality. If the answer is no, then we need to go back and revisit how we're doing our work in order to establish that and meet that quality criteria. There's two different elements to quality. There's quality control and quality assurance. Quality control refers to all of the things that we do to measure quality during the project. So in quality control, we're not actually correcting anything. We're just measuring what's happening and comparing it to our quality objectives and saying, yes, it meets it, or no, it doesn't. Quality assurance then are all of the things that take that quality control information and say, we actually need to change this, or we need to change that in order to make sure that we adjust what we're doing and meet our quality objectives. Again, you can apply these in a very formal or informal way, depending on how significant quality is as a priority for your project, how much control you think you can exert over quality in the conduct of the work, and whether or not this is more important than the scope or the time, and whether you can define very clearly what it is that quality means for your project. Ultimately, as I said, we need to ensure that the project outputs meet the objectives. And a really good mantra, which a lot of researchers don't like to hear, but it actually is really significant, I think, is that better is the enemy of good enough. This is borrowing a phrase from literature, but this is a good mantra to think about when encountering something that might need to change, where you have an opportunity to do something different on a project with the idea that this is going to make our project better. We need to evaluate whether the better is necessary, whether we can afford it, both from a time and a cost perspective, and whether this will actually add something to the expectations and requirements of our stakeholders. If doing this additional work or advancing the quality of the output that we're working towards makes it better, but really it doesn't improve the overall output of the project, then we're spending time and money and resources on that better without actually any benefit that's coming from it. So we need to very carefully evaluate when we have an opportunity to improve quality, whether that improvement is really going to contribute to meeting the objectives, or whether it's going to do what they call in industry gold plating. It adds what looks like value to the project, but in fact, it's not something that will enhance the customer's ability to use it, or enhance the usability of the outputs of the project for additional research or additional activities. So I think I showed a similar cartoon in the requirements and expectations section, where we need to make sure we understand what exactly is it that the customer needs. What is it that they're expecting to see at the end of the day? And we could make this tire swing better by using red rope instead of brown rope. We might think that that's better because it's more appealing. But if the customer doesn't care and the red rope costs twice as much, then we're not actually improving the quality, because it doesn't matter to the customer, and it's just costing our project more. So in the interest of time, I see we're almost at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to skip through the scenario. You have the scenarios and you can work through some of those questions with them. I just wanted to go through a summary of what we've talked about in these 3 sessions. We've defined what we mean by a project, and we've talked about the project management life cycle. We've looked at some key definitions of things: objectives, deliverables, constraints, and assumptions. In the last session, we looked at stakeholders and the 4 different categories: those who are involved, those who have influence, those who have an interest, and those who will be impacted or affected by the work. And we talked about risk and understanding the difference between opportunities and threats, and how we might assess and balance those. And then today we talked about the scope of work, so what work needs to be done, and the importance of avoiding scope creep. And we talked about what we mean by quality, and that we need the project's product to meet our objectives, and that we need to balance quality improvements versus things that are not necessarily going to contribute to our objectives. Just a quick reminder, the things that we'll be going over at the live conference workshop in June in Victoria. We'll get into more details around time and cost management when it comes to planning, so schedule development and budget development. We'll look at some things around controlling and monitoring, and specifically around teams and team leadership, and the importance of good communication. And then we'll talk about project closing, one of the important elements of a project lifecycle. And so I'll just conclude there and see if anybody has any questions. That question from Haley is not for me.
Hi, Robyn. Thanks, and everyone for contributing to the discussion. Haley, Haley has asked if the conference workshop will be recorded, and we are actually looking into options, but we need to talk to Robyn about that first, and then so we'll keep you posted on that. I know some of you can't attend the workshop, many of you can, which is great, and we are really looking forward to it. And yeah, Robyn, thanks for wrapping it up. It's funny, I think both scope and quality, I mean, we could do so much on both of these topics. I know in terms of research projects, academia, very, very important things to kind of wrap our heads around. And I liked how you said it's sort of empowering the more members of the team are
Yeah.
kind of thinking about these things. And understand, the balance, like you said, the scope, time, cost, quality balance. Yeah, so thanks so much. I know Rachel did have a question that you said you might be able to address at the end.
Right. Doing most of the work before writing the proposal and then using the funding. Yeah, I call that the pay it forward principle. And a lot of researchers do that. In fact, I don't think I've met one that doesn't. I think it's challenging to consider doing all of the work of a project before you actually get funded. That's really not responsible conduct of research to do that, because you're using resources that you have for one thing to do another thing. However, research work is highly interconnected, as you all know, and so there is a lot of thinking that goes into, there's a certain element of what we're going to take out of project number 1 that we're doing right now that will lead into project number 2. Even the idea of generating preliminary data that you would use in a project proposal to justify why the approach that you're planning to take would work, why your hypothesis seems to have merit and should be considered for funding. So I think you will always see the generation of data and information coming out of one project that would lead into another project. But I would say for myself, it's not good conduct of research to be doing a large amount of things on one project that are actually going to be a part of another project. Eventually, you have to pay that back at some point, and eventually you're going to run out of money, and you're running the risk of, well, what if you don't get funded on that second thing? How are you going to pay back the project that you borrowed all of that time and money from to do it? It's not a very sound approach to take in large measure, but it is a necessary part of science to a large degree, that a certain element of what you do on one project feeds into another. There's also the reality of having to bridge from the end of one project to the beginning of another, both with resources, human resources, and materials and data management. So there will always be a certain amount of that goes on.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. I think from a funder perspective, funders wouldn't love that approach, but at the same time, like you said, the interconnectedness of research projects and personnel, and of course, PIs and supervisors want to ensure that people have funding and don't sort of have a gap. So yeah, it's an interesting issue and an interesting question. So thanks for raising that, Rachel. So yeah, thank you very much, Robyn, and everyone for participating so actively. We will be sending out the recording for this session next week, and I'll send links as well to the first 2 webinars in the series. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. We'll send out a survey as usual, and I hope many of you can join us for the workshop in Victoria in June.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to meeting as many of you as possible in Victoria in a few months.